George Strait gives Janitor a chance to sing, and what he does moves everyone. The fluorescent lights of the AT&T Stadium flickered to life at 4:30 in the morning, casting harsh shadows across the empty corridors that would soon pulse with the energy of 60,000 country music fans. Miguel Hernandez pushed his Janitor's cart through the backstage area, the wheels squeaking in a rhythm that had become the soundtrack of his life for the past 23 years. What nobody knew, not his supervisors, not his co-workers, not even the security guards who nodded at him each morning, was that Miguel carried within his chest a voice that could make angels weep and devils repent. Tonight was different, though Miguel couldn't quite put his finger on why. Perhaps it was the way the September air held just a hint of autumn's promise. Or maybe it was because today marked exactly 3 years since Isabella had drawn her last breath in that sterile hospital room, her hand growing cold in his as she whispered, "Miguel, promise me you'll sing again. Promise me you won't let your voice die with me." He had made that promise with tears streaming down his weathered face, but keeping it had proven harder than watching her fade away. The irony wasn't lost on him that tonight, George Strait, the king of country himself, would grace this very stage, the man whose voice had been Miguel's companion through countless lonely nights, whose songs had taught him English when he'd crossed the border at 17, with nothing but dreams and calloused hands. Miguel had memorized every note, every inflection, every breath of Strait's catalogue, singing along in his beat-up Ford pickup truck on drives home from his 3 jobs. "Hey, Miguel." The sharp voice of Frank Morrison, the facility supervisor, cut through the morning silence like a rusty blade. "You better not be daydreaming about that concert tonight. These floors won't clean themselves, and I've got corporate breathing down my neck about tonight's inspection." Miguel nodded silently, the way he'd learned to do over the years. Frank had never missed an opportunity to remind Miguel of his place in the hierarchy, invisible, disposable, replaceable. Just last week, Frank had humiliated him in front of the entire cleaning crew when he'd caught Miguel humming Amarillo Morning while mopping the VIP lounge. "What do you think this is, wetback? Your personal karaoke bar?" Frank had sneered, using the slur with casual cruelty that made Miguel's stomach clench. "You're paid to clean, not to pretend you're some kind of cowboy singer. Stick to what you know, toilets and trash." If you're finding yourself drawn into Miguel's world, wondering how a man could carry such pain yet still hold on to hope, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from today? Your stories and support mean everything to us as we bring you these tales of courage and unexpected triumph. The memory of that humiliation burned fresh as Miguel began his systematic cleaning of the backstage area. His 2 sons, Carlos and Mateo, would be working tonight too. Carlos as part of the security team he'd joined after graduating high school, and Mateo helping with equipment setup to earn money for his senior year expenses. They didn't know their father could sing. Hell, they barely knew their father at all anymore, Miguel thought with a pang of guilt that cut deeper than any of Frank's insults. After Isabella's death, Miguel had retreated into himself, working from dawn until midnight, coming home exhausted and hollow-eyed, falling asleep in his recliner with the television droning. The boys had learned to navigate around his grief, tiptoeing through their own sorrow while their father disappeared into work and silence. They thought he didn't love music anymore, that he'd given up the guitar that now gathered dust in the corner of their modest apartment. They didn't know that sometimes when they were asleep, he'd sit on the porch and sing to the stars, his voice carrying Isabella's favorite songs into the Texas night. As Miguel worked his way through the green room, where George Strait would later prepare for his show, he couldn't help but remember the first time he'd heard The Chair playing on the radio of the construction site where he'd worked his first job in America. The foreman, an older Mexican-American named Roberto, had translated the lyrics for him, and Miguel had been amazed that country music could tell stories that felt so universal, so human. "This music," Roberto had said, "it's about real people, real problems. It don't matter if you're from Mexico or Texas or anywhere else. Pain is pain, love is love, and dreams are dreams." That night, Miguel had walked 12 miles to a second-hand store and spent his last $15 on a beat-up cassette player and a George Strait greatest hits tape. He'd worn that tape out learning English, learning to love this adopted country through its music, learning that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for a Mexican boy with country music in his heart. The sound of arriving trucks and crew members beginning their setup pulled Miguel from his memories. In a few hours, this place would transform from an empty cavern into a cathedral of country music, with George Strait as its high priest. Miguel had attended exactly one concert in his life, a local bar performance when he was 25, newly married to Isabella, full of hope and foolish dreams. He'd worked up the courage to ask the bar owner if he could sing one song during the open mic night. The laughter still echoed in his nightmares. A Mexican singing country. That's rich. What's next? A mariachi version of Friends in Low Places? The whole bar had erupted in cruel laughter, and Miguel had walked out with Isabella's hand in his, her whispered words of comfort the only thing that kept him from breaking completely. "You have something special, mi amor," she'd said that night, as they sat in their car outside that bar. "Someday, people will understand. Someday they'll listen." But someday had never come. Instead, life had happened. Babies to feed, bills to pay, dreams to bury beneath the weight of responsibility. Miguel had convinced himself that singing in church and humming while he worked was enough. It had to be enough. Now, as he methodically cleaned each surface that George Strait might touch, Miguel felt something stirring in his chest. A dangerous, familiar ache. Tonight, his hero would stand just feet from where Miguel would be working. The man whose voice had been his teacher, his comfort, his companion through 2 decades of struggle and loss, would breathe the same air, see the same lights, maybe even notice the quiet Mexican man with the careful hands who made sure everything was perfect for the show. Miguel pushed his cart toward the main stage area, where the massive screens and lights were being tested. The sound system crackled to life, and suddenly George Strait's voice filled the empty stadium, running through a sound check of Amarillo Morning. Miguel stopped dead in his tracks, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for flight. Without thinking, without checking to see if anyone was watching, Miguel began to sing along, softly at first, then with growing confidence as the familiar words poured from his soul. He closed his eyes and let the music carry him back to Isabella, back to dreams he'd thought were dead and buried. He didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows of the stage entrance, watching with growing amazement as the janitor's voice soared through the empty stadium with a purity and emotion that made the hair on his arms stand up. George Strait had arrived early for his own sound check, but what he was witnessing was something far more valuable than any technical rehearsal. The King of Country stood perfectly still, listening to his own song being transformed into something raw and beautiful and heartbreaking. This wasn't just singing. This was testimony, confession, prayer. This was a man pouring his entire life into 3 minutes and 38 seconds of music, and George Strait knew he was witnessing something extraordinary. As the song faded and Miguel opened his eyes, returning to the harsh reality of fluorescent lights and cleaning supplies, he had no idea that his life was about to change forever. He had no idea that the man he'd idolized for 20 years had just heard his deepest secret. He had no idea that tonight, September 21st, 2025, would become the night that proved Isabella right. Someday, people would listen. George Strait remained motionless in the shadows, his mind racing. In 40 years of performing, he'd heard thousands of singers, professionals, amateurs, wannabes, and has-beens. But what he'd just witnessed transcended technique or training. This man sang with the kind of authenticity that couldn't be taught, couldn't be manufactured, couldn't be faked. It was the sound of a soul laid bare, and it reminded George of why he'd fallen in love with country music in the first place. The janitor, Miguel he'd heard someone call him, had resumed his work, oblivious to the fact that destiny had just taken notice. George watched him methodically clean, noting the careful precision in his movements, the quiet dignity in his posture, despite the humble nature of his work. This was a man who took pride in whatever he did, no matter how thankless the task. "Mr. Strait?" A voice behind him made George turn. His tour manager, Jake Williams, was approaching with a clipboard and the perpetually worried expression that came with managing a 40-year career. "We're ready for your sound check whenever you are, sir." George nodded but didn't move. "Jake, do you know anything about that janitor over there, the Mexican fellow?" Jake glanced over at Miguel, who was now carefully wiping down the chrome railings near the VIP section. "Miguel Hernandez, I think. Been here forever." "Why?" "Just curious." George's mind was already forming a plan, something so unprecedented in his careful professional career that it surprised even him. "Jake, I want you to do me a favor. Find out everything you can about Miguel Hernandez, family, background, how long he's worked here, and do it quietly. Sir, if there's a security concern, no concern, just curiosity. George finally stepped out of the shadows, but Miguel had moved to another section of the stadium. Let's get that sound check done. For the next 2 hours, George went through his pre-show routine with unusual distraction. His voice coach noticed his mind wandering during warm-ups. His wardrobe assistant had to repeat questions twice. Even his longtime guitarist, Mike Daly, commented that George seemed somewhere else entirely. But George's thoughts kept returning to that voice, that raw emotion, that perfect imperfection that made Miguel's singing so compelling. It reminded him of his own early days, singing in honky-tonks across Texas, when music was pure and uncomplicated and came straight from the heart, before the industry, before the expectations, before the carefully crafted image that had made him the king of country. Meanwhile, Miguel continued his work, unaware that his world was about to shift dramatically. He'd managed to push the morning's indulgence in song to the back of his mind, focusing instead on the mounting pressure of preparing the venue for tonight's sold-out show. The afternoon brought wave after wave of crew members, vendors, and early-arriving VIPs, all adding to the chaos that Miguel navigated with practiced ease. "Hernandez!" Frank Morrison's voice cut through the backstage bustle like a whip crack. "Get over here!" Miguel hurried over, noting the unusual tension in his supervisor's face. Frank was standing with a well-dressed man Miguel didn't recognize. Expensive suit, nervous energy, the kind of person who made Frank nervous, which in turn made everyone else nervous. "This is Miguel Hernandez, one of our custodial staff," Frank said, the slight hesitation before custodial staff not lost on Miguel. "Miguel, this is Mr. Williams from George Strait's management team." Jake Williams extended his hand, which Miguel shook cautiously, acutely aware of his work gloves and uniform. "Miguel, pleasure to meet you. I understand you've been with the stadium for quite a while." 23 years, sir," Miguel replied in careful English, wondering if he was in some kind of trouble. "And you have family? Kids?" Miguel's protective instincts flared. "Yes, sir. 2 sons. They're good boys, no trouble. Carlos works security here sometimes, and Mateo—" "Oh no, Miguel, nothing like that," Jake said quickly, noting the fear in Miguel's eyes. "Mr. Strait was he's interested in the people who work so hard to make his shows possible. He wanted me to personally thank some of the long-term staff." The lie came easily, but Jake could see the relief flooding Miguel's face. Frank Morrison, however, looked confused and slightly annoyed at this unusual attention being paid to a janitor. "Well, that's very thoughtful," Frank said tightly. "Miguel, you should get back to your duties. We've got 6 hours until showtime." As Miguel walked away, Jake made mental notes. 23 years, 2 sons, 1 in security, 1 apparently still in school. The protective way he'd responded about his kids suggested a devoted father. Jake had noticed something else too. When Miguel had relaxed slightly, there'd been something in his voice, a musical quality even in normal speech that suggested, "Mr. Williams?" Frank's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Is there anything else you need regarding Mr. Hernandez?" Jake studied Frank's face, noting the subtle hostility, the way he'd emphasized custodial staff earlier. "Actually, yes. How would you describe Miguel as an employee?" "He does his job," Frank said curtly. "Shows up on time, keeps his head down, doesn't cause trouble. That's about all you can ask from someone in his position." The dismissive tone told Jake everything he needed to know about Frank Morrison's management style. "And he's been here 23 years without any problems?" "Well, there was an incident last week. Caught him singing while he was supposed to be working. Had to remind him that we don't pay him to entertain himself. But like I said, he keeps his head down now." Jake felt a surge of anger on Miguel's behalf, but kept his expression neutral. "I see. Well, thank you for your time, Mr. Morrison." As Jake walked away, he was already pulling out his phone to call George with an update. What he'd learned painted a picture of a dedicated worker being systematically diminished by a small-minded supervisor, a man who'd been invisible for over 2 decades despite his loyalty and work ethic. Back on the main floor, Miguel was setting up the final cleaning stations when he spotted his sons arriving for their evening shifts. Carlos, 21, and built like the linebacker he'd been in high school, was checking in with the security team. Mateo, 19 and still carrying the lean frame of youth, was heading toward the equipment area with the setup crew. Miguel felt the familiar mixture of pride and regret that came with seeing his boys. They were good kids, hard-working, respectful, ambitious in ways that Miguel had never dared to be. Carlos was taking night classes in criminal justice, hoping to become a police officer. Mateo was saving money for college, dreaming of becoming an engineer. They were going to have the opportunities Miguel never had, the stability he'd never known. But they were also strangers to him in many ways. After Isabella's death, Miguel had thrown himself into work to avoid the crushing weight of grief, and somewhere along the way, he'd lost touch with the man he used to be, the man who sang lullabies and told stories and dreamed big dreams with his beautiful wife. "Papa!" Mateo's voice broke through his melancholy. His younger son was jogging over, his face bright with excitement. "Can you believe George Strait is here tonight? I mean actually here, in the same building where we work." Miguel smiled at his son's enthusiasm. "Yes, mijo, it's pretty amazing. Remember when Mama used to play his music while she cooked Sunday dinner? She said you used to sing along, but I was too little to really remember." Mateo's expression grew wistful. I wish I could remember your voice, Papa. Carlos says you used to sing to us when we were little." The words hit Miguel like a physical blow. His own son couldn't remember him singing, couldn't remember the man he'd been before grief had stolen his voice, his joy, his connection to the music that had once defined him. Isabella would be heartbroken to know that her boys had grown up in a house where music had died along with her. "Maybe," Miguel started, then stopped. What was he thinking? That he could just start singing again after 3 years of silence? That he could bridge the gap that had grown between him and his sons with a few songs? "Maybe someday, mijo." Mateo nodded, but Miguel could see the disappointment in his eyes. Another promise that sounded like a polite way of saying never. As his son walked away to begin his shift, Miguel felt something crack inside his chest. Isabella's voice echoed in his memory. "Promise me you'll sing again. Promise me you won't let your voice die with me." He'd thought keeping that promise meant singing alone in the dark, whispering songs to empty rooms and silent stars. But maybe it meant more than that. Maybe it meant letting his sons hear the man their mother had fallen in love with. Maybe it meant taking up space in the world, instead of just cleaning up after everyone else. Maybe it meant believing that his voice, his Mexican accent, his working-class hands, his immigrant dreams, deserved to be heard. The arena was filling up now, early arrivals streaming through the gates with excitement that was almost palpable. Miguel could feel the energy building, the anticipation that came before a George Strait concert. In just a few hours, 60,000 people would be singing along to songs that Miguel knew by heart, celebrating an artist who had unknowingly been Miguel's teacher, his inspiration, his connection to the American dream. What Miguel didn't know was that upstairs in the VIP area, George Strait was making a decision that would change everything. Jake had delivered his report, painting a picture of a man who deserved so much more than the invisibility life had imposed on him. And George, who had built his career on songs about working people, about dignity and struggle, about the power of music to transform lives, was about to take the biggest risk of his professional life. Tonight, he was going to give Miguel Hernandez the chance he'd never had. Tonight, he was going to prove that sometimes the most powerful voices come from the most unexpected places. Tonight, he was going to show 60,000 people that real country music lived in the heart of a Mexican janitor who sang like an angel and worked like a saint. The stage was set, the crowd was gathering, and destiny was about to make its move. By 7 o'clock, the AT&T Stadium was a living, breathing organism of excitement. 60,000 country music fans had descended upon Arlington, Texas, their voices creating a symphony of anticipation that echoed through the corridors where Miguel continued his methodical work. He'd changed into his evening uniform, the slightly better shirt reserved for events where the public might actually notice the cleaning staff, and was making his final rounds before the show began. In the VIP hospitality suite, George Strait stood before a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the field, watching the crowd settle into their seats. His hands were clasped behind his back, his expression contemplative in a way that made his longtime manager, Tom Rodriguez, nervous. "George, you've been quiet all afternoon," Tom said, approaching carefully. "Everything okay? You're not getting stage fright after 40 years, are you?" George turned, and Tom was surprised to see something he rarely witnessed in his client's eyes, uncertainty mixed with determination. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust me on this." "Of course, what's on your mind?" "What if I told you I wanted to bring someone on stage tonight? Someone from the cleaning crew?" Tom's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "George, we've got 60,000 people out there, national media coverage, and this is your anniversary tour. This isn't the time for whatever this is." "It's exactly the time," George said firmly. "Tom, I've spent 40 years in this business, and I've never heard anything like what I heard this morning. There's a janitor here, Miguel Hernandez, who has a voice that could change everything. For him, for his family, maybe even for country music." Tom rubbed his temples, recognizing the stubborn set of George's jaw. When George Strait made up his mind about something, moving mountains was easier than changing his opinion. "George, think about this rationally. We don't know anything about this guy. Can he handle being in front of a crowd? What if he freezes? What if we give someone a chance who's never had one?" George interrupted. "Tom, you know where I came from. You know what it was like when nobody would listen, when doors kept slamming in my face. What if someone had taken a chance on me?" Tom sighed deeply. George's humble beginnings were well documented. The struggles, the rejections, the years of playing dive bars and honky-tonks before Nashville finally paid attention. It was part of what made him so authentic, so beloved by fans who saw their own struggles reflected in his songs. "All right," Tom said finally, "but we do this carefully. No promises, no commitments. You bring him up, maybe he sings a few lines, you thank him for his hard work, and that's it. We don't want to embarrass the man." George nodded, but Tom could see in his eyes that his client had much bigger plans than a simple acknowledgement. "Fair enough. Now I need you to do something for me." Meanwhile, 3 levels below, Miguel was experiencing what could only be described as the worst day of his professional life. Frank Morrison had been riding him mercilessly since the visit from George Strait's management, clearly suspicious about the unusual attention Miguel had received. Every task was scrutinized, every movement questioned, every moment of rest criticized. "Hernandez!" Frank's voice echoed through the service corridor where Miguel was emptying trash receptacles. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Miguel looked up, confused. He was doing exactly what he'd been doing for 23 years, his job. "Emptying the bins before the show starts, sir. Same as always." "Same as always?" Frank stepped closer, his voice dripping with malice. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're moving pretty slow for someone who's apparently caught the attention of George Strait's people. Maybe all this special attention has gone to your head." Miguel felt his stomach clench. He'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much to lose his job now. Carlos was starting his 2nd year of night school, Mateo was saving for college, and Miguel's health insurance, modest as it was, covered the medication he needed for the high blood pressure that had developed after Isabella's death. "No, sir. I'm just doing my job, same as always." "Well, let me remind you what your job is," Frank said, raising his voice so that other staff members in the corridor could hear. "Your job is to be invisible. Your job is to clean up after your betters without being seen or heard. Your job is not to sing, not to draw attention to yourself, and certainly not to think you're something special because some fancy manager asked your name." Miguel felt heat rising in his cheeks, the familiar burn of humiliation that he'd learned to swallow over the years. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't quite name, it felt different. Maybe it was seeing his sons earlier, seeing the disappointment in Mateo's eyes when he'd asked about Miguel's singing. Maybe it was the memory of Isabella's voice still echoing in his heart after 3 years. Or maybe it was simply that a man could only take so much diminishment before something inside him rebelled. "I understand, sir," Miguel said quietly, but he didn't lower his eyes the way he usually did. He looked directly at Frank, and for just a moment the supervisor seemed taken aback by the dignity in Miguel's gaze. "See that you do," Frank muttered, but he stepped back slightly. "And Hernandez? I'll be watching you extra close tonight. One screw-up, one moment where you forget your place and you're gone, 23 years or not." As Frank stalked away, Miguel leaned against the wall, his hands shaking slightly. He thought about Isabella, about the dreams they'd shared when they were young and foolish enough to believe that talent and hard work were enough. He thought about his sons, growing up without knowing the man their father used to be. He thought about all the songs locked inside his chest, all the music that would die with him if he kept living his life in the shadows. "Papa?" Carlos's voice made him turn. His older son was standing at the end of the corridor, still in his security uniform, his expression troubled. "I heard what that man said to you. Are you okay?" Miguel straightened, forcing a smile. "I'm fine, mijo. Just work things. Nothing for you to worry about." But Carlos didn't buy it. At 21, he was old enough to understand the dynamics of workplace bullying, old enough to see the way his father's shoulders had curved inward over the years, the way he'd made himself smaller and smaller until he was almost invisible. "Papa, you don't have to take that from him. You've been here longer than anyone. You work harder than anyone. You deserve respect. Respect is earned, Carlos. And sometimes it's more important to keep your head down and provide for your family. Is that what you want Mateo and me to learn? To make ourselves small so other people can feel big?" The question hit Miguel like a physical blow. Was that what he was teaching his sons? That dignity was less important than security? That dreams were luxuries that people like them couldn't afford? "No," Miguel said finally. "No, that's not what I want for you." "Then why is it what you want for yourself?" Before Miguel could answer, the sound system crackled to life throughout the stadium. George Strait's familiar voice filled the air, but instead of music, it was an announcement that made Miguel's blood run cold. "Ladies and gentlemen, in about 30 minutes, we're going to start the show. But before we do, I want to talk to you about the people who make nights like this possible, the folks who work behind the scenes, who make sure everything is perfect for you, the fans." Miguel and Carlos exchanged glances. This was unusual. George Strait was known for his professionalism, his adherence to schedule. He didn't typically make announcements before shows. "Tonight, I had the privilege of hearing something extraordinary," George continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive stadium. "I heard a voice that reminded me why I fell in love with country music in the first place. A voice that sang with the kind of truth and authenticity that you can't teach, can't fake, and can't buy." Miguel felt the world tilt slightly. It couldn't be. There was no way. That voice belongs to a man named Miguel Hernandez, who's been taking care of this stadium for 23 years, a man who's worked 3 jobs to raise 2 sons after losing his wife to cancer, a man who sings like an angel but has never had anyone listen. Carlos grabbed his father's arm, his eyes wide with shock. "Papa, is he talking about you?" Miguel couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The corridor around him seemed to spin as George Strait's voice continued to echo through the building. "Now I know this is unusual, and I know Miguel is probably somewhere in this building thinking this can't be real. But Miguel, if you can hear me, I want you to know that in 40 years of doing this, I've never been more sure of anything. Your voice deserves to be heard. Your story deserves to be told. And tonight, if you're willing, I'd like to invite you to join me on stage." The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly the sound of 60,000 people began to stir, murmuring, questioning, excited by this unprecedented moment in what was supposed to be a routine concert. Miguel sank against the wall, his legs suddenly unable to support him. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. He was Miguel Hernandez, the invisible janitor, the man who cleaned up after other people's dreams. He wasn't someone who got invited onto stages by country music legends. "Papa," Carlos whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Papa, he's talking about you. George Strait is talking about you." But Miguel could only think of one thing: Frank Morrison's threat. One screw-up, one moment where you forget your place and you're gone. What could be more of a screw-up than accepting an invitation to sing on stage when you were supposed to be emptying trash bins? Yet even as the fear coursed through him, something else was stirring in Miguel's chest. Something that felt suspiciously like hope. Something that sounded remarkably like Isabella's voice whispering, "Promise me you'll sing again." The choice was his. He could stay in the shadows, safe and invisible, and slowly dying inside. Or he could step into the light, risk everything, and finally honor the promise he'd made to the woman he'd loved with all his heart. Somewhere in the distance, 60,000 people were waiting for his answer, and Miguel Hernandez, for the first time in 3 years, was about to make his voice heard. The service corridor that had been Miguel's world for over 2 decades suddenly felt like the eye of a hurricane. All around him, staff members were emerging from doorways, their faces a mixture of shock, curiosity, and something Miguel had never seen directed at him before: respect. Word was spreading through the building like wildfire. George Strait had just called out their janitor by name, in front of 60,000 people. "Miguel!" The voice belonged to Maria Santos, a concession stand supervisor who'd worked alongside Miguel for 15 years, but had never spoken more than polite greetings. "Did you hear what he said about you?" Before Miguel could respond, his world tilted further off its axis. Frank Morrison came barreling down the corridor, his face purple with rage, followed by 2 security guards and someone Miguel didn't recognize, a woman in an expensive suit who carried herself with the unmistakable authority of upper management. "There he is." Frank pointed at Miguel like he was identifying a criminal. "That's the one who's been causing all this disruption. I told you he was trouble, always singing when he should be working, always thinking he's better than his station." The woman in the suit, Miguel would later learn she was Jennifer Walsh, the stadium's operations director, held up a hand to silence Frank. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Miguel caught something in her eyes that looked suspiciously like excitement. "Mr. Hernandez," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Jennifer Walsh. I believe you've just received quite an unusual invitation." Miguel shook her hand automatically, his mind still reeling. "Ma'am, I don't understand what's happening. I was just doing my job, and suddenly—" Miguel. The quiet voice belonged to his younger son, Mateo, who had appeared at the other end of the corridor. Behind him stood at least a dozen other crew members, all staring at Miguel with expressions ranging from amazement to pride. "Papa." The whole stadium heard it. "Everyone's talking about you." Frank stepped forward aggressively. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. This man has forgotten his place, and now he's disrupting the entire operation. Ms. Walsh, I recommend we remove him from the premises immediately before this circus gets any worse." "Remove him?" Carlos had arrived, still in his security uniform, his voice sharp with protective anger. "For what? For being recognized by George Strait himself? For having talent that apparently everyone can see except you?" "Carlos, no," Miguel started, recognizing the dangerous gleam in his older son's eyes. "Don't." But Carlos was past listening. 21 years of watching his father diminish himself, of seeing Frank Morrison's petty cruelties, of witnessing his papa accept disrespect with silent dignity, had finally reached a breaking point. "You know what, Mr. Morrison?" Carlos stepped closer to Frank, using his considerable height advantage. "For 23 years, my father has been the best employee you've ever had. He's never missed a day, never complained, never caused trouble. He's raised 2 sons while grieving his wife, worked 3 jobs and still managed to do his work here better than anyone else. And you want to fire him because George Strait, recognized his talent." "Carlos, please," Miguel whispered, but his son wasn't finished. "No, Papa. I'm tired of watching you make yourself small for people who don't deserve your respect. I'm tired of watching you hide your light under a bushel, because some people are too small-minded to see what you really are." Jennifer Walsh had been watching this exchange with growing interest. In her 15 years of stadium management, she'd seen Frank Morrison's approach to leadership, had fielded complaints about his treatment of staff, had noted the high turnover in his department. Miguel Hernandez, on the other hand, was legendary among long-term employees for his reliability and work ethic. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I think you should step back and let me handle this situation." "Ms. Walsh, with all due respect, this man is my responsibility and I know how to—" "Frank," her voice carried steel now. "Step back." Frank's face went from purple to white as he realized his authority was being undermined in front of the staff. He opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it and retreated several steps, his expression promising future retribution. Jennifer turned to Miguel, and her voice gentled. "Mr. Hernandez, I'm going to ask you directly. George Strait has invited you to join him on stage. 60,000 people are waiting to see if you'll accept. What would you like to do?" Miguel looked around at the faces surrounding him. His sons, his co-workers, the management team. Some looked expectant, some curious, some hostile, but for the first time in years none of them looked through him as if he didn't exist. Miguel's voice caught. "I don't know if I can. I mean, what if I freeze up there? What if I embarrass myself, embarrass Mr. Strait, embarrass the stadium?" "Papa," Mateo stepped forward, and Miguel was startled to see tears in his youngest son's eyes. "Do you remember when Mama was sick and she made you promise something?" Miguel's breath caught. He'd never told his sons about Isabella's final request, had kept that promise locked in his heart for 3 years. "She made you promise to sing again, didn't she?" Mateo continued. "Carlos and I, we remember more than you think. We remember you singing to us when we were little. We remember the way your voice made everything better, made everything safe, and we remember how the music died when she did." "But Papa," Carlos added, his own voice thick with emotion, "maybe it's time to let it live again. Maybe this is what she meant." Maybe this is why God let George Strait hear you today. Miguel felt something breaking open in his chest. 3 years of grief and fear and self-imposed silence cracking like ice in spring. Around him, the corridor had grown quiet, everyone sensing they were witnessing something sacred, something transformative. "Mr. Hernandez," Jennifer Walsh said softly, "I need you to know that whatever you decide, your job here is secure. Mr. Morrison's opinions notwithstanding, you're a valued employee, and nothing that happens tonight will change that." Frank made a strangled sound of protest, but Jennifer silenced him with a look that could have frozen fire. Miguel closed his eyes and heard Isabella's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. "Promise me you'll sing again. Promise me you won't let your voice die with me." For 3 years he'd thought honoring that promise meant singing alone in dark rooms, whispered lullabies to empty houses. But maybe it meant something bigger. Maybe it meant stepping into the light she'd always believed he deserved. When he opened his eyes, his sons were watching him with expressions of such hope, such pride, that it took his breath away. These were good men he'd raised, men who believed in their father even when their father had stopped believing in himself. "Okay," Miguel whispered, then cleared his throat and spoke louder. "Okay, yes, I'll do it." The corridor erupted in cheers and applause from the gathered staff. Carlos and Mateo rushed to embrace their father, and Miguel felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the fierce joy of being truly seen, truly valued, truly loved. "Excellent," Jennifer said, pulling out her radio. "Jake, this is Jennifer Walsh. Tell Mr. Strait that Miguel has accepted his invitation. We'll have him to the stage entrance in 5 minutes." As the crowd began to disperse, Frank Morrison approached Miguel one last time. His face was a mask of barely controlled rage, but he kept his voice low enough that only Miguel could hear. "You think this changes anything?" Frank hissed. "You think one moment on stage makes you something special? You're still a janitor, Hernandez. You're still a Mexican in Texas. And when this little fantasy is over, you'll still be cleaning toilets and taking orders from people like me. Don't forget who you really are." Miguel looked at Frank for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet strength that made Frank step back involuntarily. "You're right, Mr. Morrison. I am a janitor. I am Mexican, but I'm also a father who raised 2 incredible sons. I'm a husband who loved a wonderful woman. I'm a man who's worked honestly for 23 years, and tonight, I'm someone who George Strait thinks deserves to be heard. If that's who I really am, then I'm proud to be me." Frank's face twisted with impotent fury, but before he could respond, Jennifer Walsh reappeared with Jake Williams and 2 security guards. "Miguel, these gentlemen will escort you to the stage area. Your sons can come too, if you'd like." "Yes," Miguel said immediately. "Yes, I'd like that very much." As they walked through the corridors toward the stage, Miguel could hear the crowd growing restless, could feel the energy building to a crescendo. In just a few minutes, he would step onto that stage in front of more people than lived in his entire hometown, back in Mexico. He would stand beside his hero, the man whose voice had taught him English and hope, and the meaning of American dreams. "Papa," Carlos said as they approached the stage entrance, "are you scared?" Miguel considered the question seriously. "Terrified," he admitted. "But for the first time in 3 years, I'm terrified of something that might be wonderful instead of something that might be terrible." "What are you going to sing?" Mateo asked. Miguel smiled, thinking of Isabella, thinking of dreams deferred but not destroyed, thinking of promises that sometimes took years to keep. "I think I'll let Mr. Strait decide. After all, he's been my teacher for 20 years. It's time to show him what I've learned." The stage entrance loomed before them, and beyond it Miguel could hear the crowd, could feel their anticipation like a living thing. Somewhere out there, George Strait was waiting. Somewhere out there, 60,000 people were about to discover that sometimes the most extraordinary voices come from the most ordinary places. Miguel Hernandez, janitor and dreamer, father and widower, immigrant and American, was about to step into the light. And for the first time since Isabella's death, he wasn't afraid of what people might see when they looked at him. He was ready to sing. The stage entrance was a portal between worlds. On one side, the familiar backstage corridors where Miguel had spent half his lifetime invisible and unheard. On the other, a universe of lights and sound, and 60,000 expectant souls. As they approached, Miguel could hear George Strait's voice warming up the crowd, building the anticipation for what he'd called something truly special. "Ladies and gentlemen," George's voice echoed through the stadium, "I've been privileged to perform for you wonderful folks for 4 decades. I've sung about working people, about family, about love and loss, and the dreams that keep us going. But tonight, you're going to hear those themes lived, not just sung. Tonight you're going to meet a man who embodies everything that country music stands for." Miguel's hands were shaking as Jake Williams handed him a wireless microphone and a small earpiece. "Just remember," Jake said kindly, "George will guide you through everything. Follow his lead, sing from your heart, and trust that voice that made him stop everything to find you." Carlos and Mateo flanked their father, both of them struggling with their own emotions. Mateo reached out and straightened Miguel's work shirt, a gesture so tender and protective that Miguel had to blink back tears. "You look perfect, Papa," Mateo whispered. "Mama would be so proud." "She is proud," Carlos added, his voice thick. "She's watching, Papa, I know she is." Through the stage entrance, Miguel could see George Strait in profile, commanding the stage with the ease of a man who'd done this thousands of times. The lights were blazing, the crowd was electric, and the magnitude of what was about to happen hit Miguel like a physical force. "And now," George announced, "I'd like you to give a Texas-sized welcome to a man who's worked here for 23 years, who raised 2 fine sons while grieving the love of his life, who sings with the voice of an angel and the heart of a true country soul. Ladies and gentlemen, Miguel Hernandez." The roar that went up from the crowd was unlike anything Miguel had ever heard. It was the sound of 60,000 people choosing to believe in magic, choosing to embrace the unexpected, choosing to celebrate someone they'd never heard of, simply because George Strait had vouched for him. Miguel stepped onto the stage, and the lights hit him like a warm embrace. For a moment he was completely overwhelmed. The size of the crowd, the intensity of the lights, the surreal nature of standing where his hero commanded such reverence. He stumbled slightly, caught himself, and then felt George Strait's steady hand on his shoulder. "Easy there, Miguel," George said quietly, his voice not carrying to the microphones. "Just breathe. Look out there. Those are your people. Working folks, dreamers, people who understand struggle and heart. They're already on your side." Miguel looked out at the sea of faces, and something extraordinary happened. Instead of seeing judgment or skepticism, he saw curiosity, warmth, and something that looked remarkably like hope. In the front rows, he could make out individual faces. A woman about Isabella's age wiping tears from her eyes, a man in a work shirt giving him a thumbs up, teenagers holding up phones to capture this unprecedented moment. "Miguel," George said, now speaking into his microphone so the crowd could hear, "I want you to know that in 40 years of doing this, I've never been more certain about anything. Your voice deserves to be heard. Will you sing with me?" Miguel nodded, not trusting his voice yet. George smiled and turned to his band. "Boys, let's do Amarillo Morning, but let's let Miguel take the lead on this one." The opening notes filled the stadium, and Miguel felt something shift inside his chest. This was the song he'd been singing when George had discovered him, the song that had started this impossible journey. As the familiar melody washed over him, he closed his eyes and thought of Isabella, of their Sunday mornings when she'd played George Strait while cooking breakfast, of the dreams they'd shared when the world was young and anything seemed possible. When he opened his eyes and began to sing, the transformation was instantaneous. His voice, rich and textured with emotion and experience, filled every corner of the massive stadium. But it wasn't just technically proficient, it was storytelling in its purest form, each note carrying the weight of 23 years of early mornings and hard work, of loving and losing, of dreams deferred but never quite abandoned. Amarillo Morning, up from San Antone, everything that I got is just what I've got on. The crowd fell into complete silence, mesmerized by the raw authenticity of Miguel's performance. This wasn't a polished Nashville sound. This was something deeper, more honest, more real. This was a man singing his life, and 60,000 people recognized truth when they heard it. George Strait, the king of country himself, stood slightly back, watching with undisguised emotion as Miguel transformed his song into something both familiar and entirely new. The Mexican accent that Frank Morrison had mocked added a layer of authenticity that made the lyrics come alive in unexpected ways. This wasn't cultural appropriation. This was cultural fusion at its most beautiful, the American dream made manifest in music. As Miguel reached the chorus, something magical happened. The crowd began to sing along, 60,000 voices joining his in a celebration of working-class dignity and resilience. Carlos and Mateo, watching from the stage wings, were openly weeping, seeing their father not as the broken man who'd retreated into himself after their mother's death, but as the vibrant, passionate person their mother had fallen in love with. When the song ended, the stadium erupted. People were on their feet, cheering, crying, celebrating not just Miguel's performance, but everything he represented: the dignity of honest work, the power of perseverance, the beauty of dreams that refuse to die no matter how deeply they're buried. George stepped forward and embraced Miguel, whispering something in his ear that the microphones didn't catch. Then he turned to the crowd, his own voice thick with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, I told you this was going to be special, but I don't think any of us were prepared for what we just witnessed. Miguel, that was extraordinary." Miguel, overwhelmed by the response, managed to find his voice. "Thank you," he said into the microphone, his words carrying clearly through the stadium. "Thank you for listening. This is for my Isabella, who believed in dreams even when I stopped believing in them myself." The crowd's response was deafening, but George wasn't finished. He'd been planning this moment since his conversation with Tom Rodriguez, and he was about to take the biggest risk of his career. "Miguel," George said, "I have a proposition for you. I've got 3 more shows on this tour: Houston, San Antonio, and a final show back here in Dallas. Would you consider joining me for all of them? Would you consider letting more people hear that incredible voice?" Miguel stared at George in shock. 3 more shows, with George Strait, in front of hundreds of thousands of people. It was beyond anything he'd ever imagined, beyond any dream Isabella had encouraged him to dream. Miguel looked toward the stage wings where his sons were watching, their faces glowing with pride and excitement. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes, Papa," Carlos shouted from the wings, forgetting he wasn't supposed to be heard. "Say yes." The crowd picked up the chant, 60,000 voices calling "Say yes," until the stadium shook with their enthusiasm. Miguel looked out at all those faces, at the crowd that had embraced him without reservation, at the man who'd been his hero for 20 years and was now offering him a chance at something extraordinary. He thought of Isabella, of the promise he'd made, and finally, truly kept. He thought of his sons, who were seeing their father not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man capable of rising to any occasion. "Yes," he said into the microphone, and the word echoed through the stadium like a thunderclap. "Yes, Mr. Strait. It would be an honor." The celebration that followed was unlike anything anyone in attendance had ever experienced. George and Miguel sang 2 more songs together, The Chair and Check Yes or No, with Miguel's voice growing stronger and more confident with each note. By the end of the evening, videos of the performance were already going viral, spreading across social media platforms and news outlets worldwide. But the real magic happened after the show, in the quiet of the empty stadium. Miguel sat on the edge of the stage, his sons beside him, looking out at the now vacant seats where 60,000 people had just witnessed his rebirth. "Papa," Mateo said quietly, "what happens now?" Miguel considered the question seriously. In a few hours, he'd gone from invisible janitor to viral sensation. George Strait's management team was already talking about recording contracts, tour opportunities, media appearances. The life he'd known for 23 years was over, and something entirely new was beginning. "Now," Miguel said, pulling his sons close, "now we see what happens when you honor your promises, even when it takes 3 years to figure out how. Now we see what happens when you stop making yourself small and start taking up the space you deserve in this world." Carlos looked at his father with new eyes. "Are you scared?" Miguel smiled, thinking of all the stages yet to come, all the songs yet to be sung, all the dreams yet to be realized. "Terrified," he admitted. "But Isabella always said that the best things in life happen when you're brave enough to be terrified." As they walked out of the stadium together, not through the service entrance where Miguel had spent 23 years being invisible, but through the main corridors where tonight everyone knew his name, Miguel felt Isabella's presence as clearly as if she were walking beside them. The janitor with the voice of gold had finally found his stage. The promise had been kept. The dream, deferred but never destroyed, was finally coming true. And in the distance, barely audible but unmistakably real, Miguel could swear he heard Isabella singing.